Hello and welcome to the third installment of Grammar Development with LFG and XLE. The last time, just to recap, you I gave you some LFG and XLE basics. We understood the relationship between C structure and F structure. We talked about functional annotation and unification, consistency and coherence. Very, very important principles within LFG. We looked at templates, and we looked at the XLE, and you were supposed to have done the XLE walkthrough as part of the exercise. So I hope you have done that, because like I said last time, the XLE walkthrough is very, very rich in information, in background information, and in teaching you how to do basic things within LFG. This time, in Lesson 3, we'll look at lexical rules, which is something that LFG is very, very famous for and is a very basic part of the syntactic framework. We'll in particular look at the passive, which is what it was developed for in the very beginning, but we'll also look at the English dative alternation, also known as dative shift, and we'll talk a little bit about the interaction between these lexical rules, and part of your practical exercise for this time will be to actually implement the interaction. And then at the very end, we'll look at different types of functional equations and constraints. You've seen some of those, but I'll teach them to you explicitly this time. And that's it for Lesson 3. It doesn't look very, very much, but it is in fact quite a bit of work that we have to get through. So let's get started with that. So a feature that LFG is very well known for, like I just said, is the lexical rule. At the time that LFG was invented, which was in the late 1970s, the first book that really talked about LFG is from 1982, but in the late 70s is when it first got started. At that time, the dominant syntactic framework thought of generalizations in terms of generalizations among relationships between sentences in terms of transformation, in terms of syntactic transformation. So the idea was that you would take a certain type of syntax, a certain type of syntactic tree, and transform it into another tree. This is still the dominant thinking within syntactic theories. A lot of the terminology is in terms of derivations, not transformations anymore, but derivations. And you think of some types of sentences coming from other types of sentences being based on that. So you'll hear a lot of that if you look at syntactic frameworks. A very famous example that was discussed back then is the passive. The linguistic observation, which is a true observation, is that active clauses are related to passive clauses via a generalizable rule. So the example down here is an active clause, the tiger chased the cat. A passive, the corresponding passive to that would be the cat was chased by the tiger. Okay, and it's very clear you get these types of verbs. These are agentive, transitive verbs, and there's always an active version and a passive version, and you want to have one rule that figures out or that tells you how to do this. And like I said, back in the 1970s, you had, back then it was transformational grammar. And what transformational grammar thought what was happening is that they postulated a rule, something like this here. There's one NP, a verb, followed by another NP, so NP1 and NP2. That's the active version. And you make a transformation. You transform this syntactic configuration into something where the NP, the second NP, NP2, comes first, followed by an auxiliary, followed by the verb, followed by the preposition by, followed by the first NP. So in our example, the NP1 is the tiger, verb is chased, NP2 is the cat, so the active part would be the tiger chased the cat, and we would take that and transform it into NP2 first, so the cat, an auxiliary was, the verb chased, the preposition by, and NP1 the tiger, so the cat was chased by the tiger. Okay, so this is a very general transformation, and this is how you made passives. Over time, however, it was realized that this was not the best way to express what happens with passive across languages. So it works well for English, that's how they got started. But if you look at how passives work across languages in the world, that's not the best generalization. And in particular within something called relational grammar, there was work by David Perlmutter and Paul Postel, and they showed that the best way to understand the relationship between active and passive was in terms of grammatical relations. So in LFG terms, this was taken up very quickly within LFG, and this was formulated in terms of a lexical rule. So in particular, work by David Perlmutter and Paul Postal showed that the relationship between active and passive was best understood in terms of grammatical relations. Their work was done with something called relational grammar, but LFG incorporated this insight very quickly. And in LFG, this was formulated in terms of a lexical rule. So if you think of the tiger chased the tiger is the subject, the cat is the object. What happens is that the original object, the cat, becomes a subject. And then the original subject, the tiger, becomes an adjunct, or what sometimes is called an oblique agent. So you can decide which option you're going to take. So that means the tiger chased the cat becomes the cat is now the subject. The cat was chased by the tiger. By the tiger is now an adjunct or an oblique agent, depending on your linguistic treatment of this. Okay, it tends to be optional, so an adjunct is quite a good option. So this is what's called a lexical rule. And the verbs which allow for the passive encode this rule as part of their lexical entry. And we'll show you how to do that in a minute. Okay, what's very crucial about this thing is that LFG really insisted on putting this information in the lexicon. And the reason for that is that not all verbs allow for passivization. Passives are generally formed with ditransitive verbs, so transitives or ditransitives, agentive ones. They don't work with statives, for example, and there's a whole range of other verbs they don't work with, any intransitives, of course. So here's an example of a stative. The dog had a bone, the dog subject, bone object, but in fact you can't say something like a bone was had by the dog in English. That is bad under a passive interpretation. Okay, so it's a very lexical type of thing. Only agentive ditransitive verbs for English do this kind of stuff, which is why you encode it in the lexicon, lexical property of verbs, and especially encoded in terms of lexical rules. Okay, now let's look at how lexical rules are done in LFG. Within LFG, lexical rules are done, not within LFG, within XLE, lexical rules are done as a special kind of template. You've seen what templates are. We looked at them in the last lesson. You should have experimented with them in the walkthrough. You will be working with them some more. And lexical rules are treated just as a special kind of template. They always take a parameter. Remember, we had templates which didn't have to take a variable, and we had templates which could. So you could pass in a predicate value, etc. Lexical rules always take a parameter, a variable, a single one. That single parameter is the subcategorization frame, so in our case, subject-object. And they contain at least two disjuncts. So what each lexical rule says is we have one case in which nothing happens, you just spit out subject-object again. And we have another case in which then we apply what was thought of as a transformation in the old times. So where the subject becomes an adjunct and the object becomes a subject. Okay. And relationships between the original and the derived grammatical functions are stated as follows. Object becomes a subject. Here's what a typical passive rule would look like. So we have the template name. That's passive up here. We have the variable, frame we've called it here. We could call it anything. This is a variable. We could call it f, we could call it p, we could call it x. We've called it frame here to remind ourselves that what's being passed in is the subcategorization frame. And then here's the first disjunct. This disjunct just gives you back the subcategorization frame. So if you've passed in subject-object, it'll just give you subject-object back, and it'll mark that in fact this is not a passive. Here's the second disjunct. It says, okay, take this frame, mark it as passive plus, and turn the former object into a subject. So the cat object becomes the cat subject. Take the former subject, the tiger, and turn it into an oblique agent by the tiger, or just delete it. So that would just, in this case, the sentence would just be the cat was chased. Okay, and that's it. Then all the disjunctions are done. And I'll show you how this works in the grammar itself. We're going to be working with something called Grammar 2 now, and a new test suite, Test Suite 2. Both of these items are downloadable. You should be you will work with them for your practical exercise, and I'll go through the grammar now and the test suite and show you what's new. Down there I've got passives to remind myself what I'm showing, so I'm going to show you how the passive works. And I'm also going to show you a bit more about test suites, how test suites work, because I would like to emphasize again, it is extremely important that you work with test suites. So I'll show you the command parse test file, and I'll show you 0 exclamation, what that means. That's for ungrammatical sentences. Okay, so now let's look at the grammar a little bit. We'll bounce out of this presentation, and I'll make this bigger again. And I'm going to call up the grammar. It's now grammar 2. Here's our grammar, and I'll make that bigger as well. Okay, so let's look at the grammar first. This is some rules have been added to the version that you've seen before. The configuration section is exactly the same as what you've seen before. The S rule is exactly the same. S goes to NP-VP, nothing there has changed. The VP rule has become a little bit more complicated. What we've added in here is an auxiliary. This is for the was in the passive, and it's in brackets, which means it's optional. So a VP consists of an optional auxiliary, a verb, that's the head, it's obligatory, a noun phrase, which is the direct object, which is accusative. This is as before. And what we've added here is also the noun phrase, the object is optional because you can have intransitive sentences. We've also added an optional PP, which is marked as being the oblique agent. This is for the by phrase, so by the tiger. So we've put that in there. The NP rule is as before, optional determiner with noun. We've added a new rule for the PP to cover that. PP consists of a P, a preposition, and a noun phrase. Now, as the comment tells you, this is a very, very simplified version of the PP rule. We'll do PPs in more detail in the next session. Right now this will serve for our purposes. Okay, so we've just got 4 rules now. We have got a lot more templates. Last time, remember, we had no templates. This time we have a lot of templates. Among them, the passive lexical rule. Okay, so it's in the template section. It's treated as a template. It's a special kind of template, but it is a template. And it looks pretty much what we just had on the slides. I've called it pass to shorten it. Frame is our variable that's being passed in. And we have a disjunction, no passive, just give back the subcat frame. And what I've forgotten here is it should be passive minus as well. So let's put that in there. Mark it as such, so mark it as no passive. No passive. And I've added something into this rule. If I want to make sure that I've actually got the syntax right for the rule, I can type, the walkthrough told you this, I can type escape Q, and it'll format it for me. It's a good way to check whether whatever you've done is the right syntax. So it's formatted it for me, and that looks quite good. So we have a frame, I'll format it a lot better, and no passive. Or the next disjunct is passive. We'll take the subcategorization frame. So imagine we've put in subject-object. In the first disjunct, nothing happens except that we mark it as not being passive. In the second disjunct, we mark it as being passive. We turn the object into a subject. So the cat becomes the cat subject. The former subject becomes an oblique agent, either by the tiger or null. It's deleted. And then it'll have to be an adjunct. What we've got in here as well is a constraining equation that says make sure that the participle, that it's actually the verb form, is in the past participle form. So chased and not chases or something like that. Okay, and I'll talk about this type of equation again. What it's saying here is make sure that it's a past participle form, not any type of verb, but a past participle form. That's the generalization for English. Okay, so that's our template. That's our lexical rule for the passive. We have got a number of templates. We've got a transitive template. This will be called up by all transitive verbs. And what the transitive template says is that I have a subcarization frame, subject, object, with some kind of predicate that's being passed in. And the subcarization frame is subject to the passive lexical rule. All of this is the variable that's being passed in as frame above. Okay, that's what's being passed into the passive lexical rule. That's what's being operated upon. And all transitive verbs, transitive agentive verbs, will have this template in their lexical entry. Let's look at one of those. So devoured, this is in our lexicon, is an example of this. So we have devoured, verb, trans-devour, it's calling up that transitive template. It's also giving us information saying either it's a past tense with indicative mood or it's a past participle. Okay, this is another template, past P. All this says is participle is equal to past. We can look at that in a second. Okay, so what we've got is we've got a template, trans. We put in the predicate, devour, the stem. We can go look at the trans template again. Here we are. Okay, so the devour says I'm a transitive verb. I take a subject and an object. Devour will be in here. And I'm subject to the passive lexical rule. So this whole frame gets stuck in there and can be operated on. So what devour can be is it can be subject-object, subject with nothing, or subject with an oblique agent. The cat was chased by the tiger. Those are the three options we're giving it. And we'll see that work in a little bit. But first, let's go through the rest of the grammar to look at it. We have an intransitive template for intransitive verbs. It's quite simple. It just says subject, and this P is whatever is passed in, something like walk or appear. We have an optional transitive template. It should be familiar to you from the walkthrough. This is true for many verbs in English, that they could be either transitive or intransitive, things like eat, for example, so it's for verbs like that. And then we have a bunch of templates that just make typing easier. Tense is T, so present, for example, mood. Predicate P, just pass in the pred. Here's the past P template we just had. Participle is past. Okay. And then we have two more templates which are a bit more complicated. We have vpres, that says tense present. It's calling up this other tense template. And mood indicative, it's calling up the mood template. Okay, it's saying present indicative. This is for present tense verbs in English. And then we've got tense past, or vpast, which is just saying it's past tense, and mood indicative. So what you can see here is that these templates are calling up other templates. Remember last time I said you can do that. It gives you a type of hierarchy. And usually we haven't done any more than 2 or 3 levels of embeddings. So this is now 2 levels of embeddings here. Okay, so that's all the templates. Now let's have a look at the lexicon. The lexicon has expanded a little bit from what you've seen before. We have bone in the singular, bone in the plural. Notice that the lexicon doesn't use very many templates as yet. There's a few templates, for example, in here, 8, it says I'm opt-trans, it's using that template, but it's not using the templates for tense and mood, which exist. Part of what your practical work will be is to go through this grammar and clean it up so that all the lexical entries will use templates rather than having all the features specified here. It makes it much easier to debug in the end, and if you're making changes, it makes it much easier. So that will be your exercise, one part of your exercise for this time. Anyway, so we have bones, bones, homework, dog, dogs, etc. We have these verbs, ate, eats, drinks, devoured. They all work the same way. What we have with the present tense verbs, at least for some of them, we don't have it for all of them. This is one place where the grammar still needs work. Eats says nothing about subject-verb agreement. devours does. Devours says third person subject, subject person is 3 and subject number is 3. Okay, and appears also has that information, but drinks doesn't. So that is one place where the grammar needs some fixing. It needs to be consistent in how it does subject-verb agreement. That will be part of your exercise as well. Okay, then we have sleep, sleeps. Here we have a new thing, a preposition, by preposition. And all we've done so far is just said P form, that stands for prepositional form, is equal to by. And again, this needs to be much more complicated eventually, but for now it'll do. We have an auxiliary, was, aux. Remember, we had that in the VP rule. It says tense past, and it has some information about subject-verb agreement. So what it says, it's either subject person 1 or subject person 2, or, no, and the subject number is singular. Okay, but it can't be second person, so you can say I was, he was, she was, but for anything that's plural, we cannot use it, they were, we were, and for second person singular, we can't use it either, you were. Okay, so it's just first and third person singular. That's what this is saying. That's what the subject needs to be. And then we have the determiners from last time. Okay, and that's our grammar. So now let's see how this works. We had to make a whole lot of changes actually for the passive. So I will start, hang on, where is it? Here. I will start a new XLE process and I will create the parser, that's grammar2.lfg, and then I will show you my test suite, which is 2. Okay, here's the test suite. This is test suite 2.lfg, and it's based on test suite 1, but it's got some new sentences in it, so let's just make sure. This is a sentence from last time, the dog devours a bone. This is an active sentence. Let's make sure it still works, and in fact it does. We have a sentence, NP, VP. NP consists of determiner noun phrase, VP consists of VP noun phrase, and what we have is we have an F structure down here, which says that pred is devour, and we have a dog is the subject, and bone is the object, and we have some information about that. So that looks good. Now let's try the passive version down here. A bone was devoured by the dog. Again, remember, in order to parse this, I don't have to retype it. I can just go escape, Control P, and it parses that sentence for me. If my window is not showing all the information, I can just type R on my keyboard, and it's supposed to resize, but it's not doing it properly. So I'll have to do it manually. Okay. So I'll put it up here so we can look at it side by side. So what do we have here? We have a sentence consisting of an NP and a VP again. The NP is determiner N, and we can see that it's the subject of the sentence. Okay, bone is the subject. The VP now consists of an auxiliary, a verb, and a PP. The auxiliary is was. The verb is devoured, and the PP is by the dog. And if we look at the F structure, what are all these things doing? We already had the subject. Devour says, I have 2 arguments, dog and bone is in fact an oblique agent. Okay, not bone. No, sorry. I read it wrong. Bone is the subject, the dog is the oblique agent. Okay, that's correct, by the dog. And it has a P form by, that's coming from by. And participle is past, that's coming from devour, and it's passive sentence and tense past. So this is exactly what we want. So it's doing exactly what we want. So that's quite good. Okay. Your exercise will be to work with this and to add another lexical rule, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Right now what I want to show you is I want to finish showing you, telling you about the test suite. What you can see here is that I've already parsed all these sentences. I wanted to make sure they work the way I want them to. And what you've got here in brackets is I went through and I parsed the entire test suite. I said something like parse test file. Well, I didn't say something like, I said exactly this, test suite2.lfg. What this command does is it takes an entire test suite that you've gotten and it parses each sentence in it, and it remembers, or it tells you how many parses there were for each sentence. So what this number in brackets does, it says there was one parse, it took 0 CPU seconds and 13 subtrees were unified. And then it'll say the same for the next sentence. And it'll remember that in something called testsuite.lfg.new. I've made that my new test suite, and now I know exactly how many parses I had for something, and I can keep rechecking that as I'm adding to the grammar. Over here, this is a special notation I want to point out. It says 0 exclamation mark. What that means is that this sentence is ungrammatical and I want it to be ungrammatical. It's got 0 parses, and this exclamation mark says, and it should be 0. So don't get upset, XLE, if it's 0, it should be 0. This should be ungrammatical, right? These were all our bad sentences from last time. The dog devours bones, the dog appears bones, very bad, the dog devours, and the dog devours bones in the park. Actually, that shouldn't be bad, that's a mistake. That just has 0 parses. We still need to fix this up, the grammar, in order to make this work. But right now it has 0 parses. This one used to be bad, but I fixed that. Bone now has a predicate value. Now it's good. Okay, so I have my test suite. It's now 7 sentences. I've got some information at the end. It took 0.010 CPU seconds total, etc. So it gives you a whole bunch of statistics, and you can read more about test suites in the particular part in the XLE documentation. I just want you to show how parse test file works. So if I say, okay, I've got my test suite, I made a change to the grammar. In fact, I did. I added a passive minus somewhere. Let's see if everything still works. I can do that. And it'll give me all these statistics. Let's make it one tree so that we can look at it. It says, here's what I did. Parse test file test suite 2 LFG. It says I'm parsing them. First sentence, 5 words. There was 1 parse. There's still 1 parse. Second sentence, 1 parse. There's still 1 parse. There's some unknown word here in sentence 3. So something happened there. Oh yeah, that's because there was something wrong there. All these things don't have a parse. They're not supposed to have a parse. Here is the last one, word possibly causing probably causing problem is park. In fact, we haven't put park in there. So now what it says is there were 7 sentences, 0 errors, and this is the important part, 0 mismatches. So it parsed exactly the same way I had parsed before. So I made a change to the grammar, but it parsed exactly. 4 sentences had 0 parses. Those were the ones I didn't want to have parses. And 3 sentences had grammatical parses. So that's good. And then it gives you a whole bunch of other statistics. So take a look at this. And it tells you new test file printed on test suite 2. And statistics are there. So these are all these files you can take a look at. I won't do that now. I just wanted to point that out. Remember, always use a test suite. Always do regression testing. One more thing about the test suite. In order for parse test file to work, what needs to happen is that you have this comment with this hash mark. Then you need a blank line, and then you need the sentence itself. If you do it like this, where you don't have a blank line, it won't work. Okay, it won't recognize that this is the sentence it has to parse. So leave a blank line like that, and then it'll work quite nicely. Okay, so that is that. Now let's go back to the presentation and talk a little bit more about test suites. So I said this again, but I said this already, but I'm going to say this again. It's important. Test suite 2 builds on test suite 1. Always work with a test suite. I always work with a test suite. Always test the previous sentences you had already implemented or excluded from being parsed, what we just did now, where I said this one should be bad, 0 exclamation mark. Make sure it stays bad. Sometimes things that were bad become good because you made some changes to the grammar. Make sure those are still bad. So make sure you incrementally increase the coverage of your grammar rather than simply changing which phenomena it can cover. It's very easy to do that. You get into adjectives and you work on adjectives and you turn around and suddenly your participles are broken. It happens very quickly. If you don't keep paying attention, your grammar will just be different. It won't be bigger. Okay, so leaving test suites aside now, let's turn back to argument alternations. The passive is known as an example of what is more generally known as argument alternations, and you find a lot of linguistic literature on this. Beth Levine she has written a book on English verb classes. She's talked a lot about argument alternations. She has several books on argument structure. They're computationally very, very relevant, not only if you're doing English, but if you're doing verb resources for other languages. These things are known as verb nets, or have become known as verb nets. So look for her work, Beth Levine, very important. One of the famous argument alternations is the English dative shift. And I've given you an example here. The girl gave a bone to the dog. That would be the basic case. And the girl gave the dog a bone. That is basically the same thing, except that here we don't have a prepositional phrase. What we do is we have what's called a secondary object. Okay. This dative shift can also be treated via lexical rule, and within the LFG grammars it generally is. It's a lexical rule because, again, not all verbs readily allow for dative shift. Things like the girl pulled the bone to the dog is good, but the girl pulled the dog a bone is not very good. There's a long literature, or a large literature on this as well. It used to be the case that people thought that some of these verbs just categorically did not allow for dative shift, but there's been more work recently by Joan Bresnan and several co-authors where she did many, many corpus studies, and she showed it really depends on several factors, whether you have pronouns, the context, etc. If you're interested in that, go look for that. It's all about the dative shift, very recent, not very recent, but within the last 5 or 6 years. Okay, but the point is that many verbs allow it, some verbs don't allow it, some verbs allow it in certain contexts and under certain conditions. So it's a lexical property. So again, a lexical rule. And in fact, the passive and the dative shift, they interact. So if you have the base case, the girl gave a bone to the dog, you can passivize that as well. A bone was given to the dog by the girl. The other option, the girl gave the dog a bone, can also be passivized. The dog was given a bone. Now what's interesting about this is in English, the object is always next to the verb, right? So gave a bone, this is the object. What does the passive say? The passive says take the object, make that the subject. Take the old subject and make it a by phrase or an adjunct, a PP, obl, or an adjunct. Okay, that's exactly what's happening here. Let's look at the next sentence. What's the object here? It's the dog. The passive says take the dog, make it a subject. Take the former subject, make it a by phrase. Okay, that's what's happening here. So you cannot derive this sentence from that sentence. This is the base case that the passive applies to. This is the other case which the passive applies to. Okay? So what happens is that the passive and the dative shift interact, and one challenge that you will have in your practical work is to figure out how they actually interact. Basically what you need to do is you need to formulate a template for ditransitive verbs, for verbs with 3 arguments, and this template should call up the passive and the dative shift lexical rule in the right order. So one will be embedded under the other. And I won't tell you which one. You can experiment with that. That's part of what you should figure out in the practical work. Okay. So I will show you what the dative shift looks like with an LFG. So in the dative shift, the subject stays the same. It doesn't move, or it doesn't change. The object and the obl, the PP argument, they undergo the alternation. So if you look at these examples, the girl gave a bone to the dog, subject, object, and we'll call this an obl2, just to differentiate it from the obl by. The girl gave the dog a bone, subject, object, and we'll call this object 2. We can call this other things as well, but for now we'll just call it an object 2. So the lexical rule will be object goes to object 2, and the obl2 goes to object. Okay, so the former obl2 becomes an object, the former object becomes an object 2, a secondary object. This is what it would look like with an XLE. You have the name of the lexical rule, dat shift I've called it here. You have this variable frame, again the same principle, first disjunct, just the base case, you just give the basic subcategorization back out, subject, object, obl2. Or you do dative shift and the object becomes an object 2 and the obl2 becomes an object. Okay, that's basically it, and you don't have to add anything more for the disjunctions. So that's basically what you should implement as part of your practical work. So remember this slide, and when it comes to that part of the practical work, come back to this one and have a look at the rule. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit and tell you something else that is important, which you need to know from here on in order to be able to write your rules very well. And that is basically about different kinds of functional equations. So the background is that LFG is a unification formalism. All the functional annotations are collected up and unified into an F-structure representation. Okay? And that means that different parts of the grammar can specify information about the same feature-value pair. So one part of the grammar can say, as we saw just now, I need, whatever happens to be here, I need the verb to be in the participle form. And then the verb has to specify whether it's a participle or not. And then those two pieces of information are brought together and the grammar checks for well-formedness whether everything is fine. Okay, so that information must unify. Another example that we've seen a lot is subject-verb agreement. So the subject noun will say something like, I'm a singular noun. And the verb will say, well, I need my subject to be singular, or it'll say plural. In this case, the information will unify and everything will be fine. This sentence will be well formed. If the verb said, I need my subject to be plural, then unification would fail. Okay, so there are various types of constraints to accomplish this. Most of the equations we've seen so far have been defining equations. Defining equations are just the equal sign. But the LFG formalism allows for various other types of equations. We've seen several others so far. The existential constraint, and I'll give you examples of these again in the next few slides. We saw that as part of the count noun template in lesson 2. Constraining equation, that was the participle needs to be a past participle. We saw that as part of the passive lexical rule. And negative constraint, and we've seen that actually as part of subject-verb agreement, but I'll show you some more slides on that. Okay, so here is what they look like. Defining equations, this is what we've seen mostly. They just contribute a value for the specified attribute. They'll say something like, ups person is equal to 3. So whatever the attribute is will have a certain value. It's a defining equation. It says, whatever your attribute is, this is your value. Then you have constraining equations. What this does, it checks whether the specified attribute has the specified value, but it doesn't actually introduce the value. Okay, that needs to come from somewhere else in the grammar, from the lexicon or from the rules or from some templates. Okay, so attribute sub C value. So example, check in the passive lexical rule that the form of the verb is indeed a past participle. So this sub C, this is a constraint, a type of equation you'll be using a lot if you're writing grammar as well. Then there are negated constraints. Make sure that the specified attribute does not have the specified value, and you see the squiggle in front of the equal sign. And the example that we've seen is something like, if subject number is singular, make sure that the subject person is not third person. Make sure it's not 3. Okay? We've seen that in some of the lexical entries. You can go back to Grammar 2 and have a look. So the squiggle says not. Then existential constraints. This says that we have a certain attribute we want this attribute to exist. We need this attribute to exist, but we don't know what the value is. Okay, and a good example for that is that count nouns may, in their singular version, they will say that they will need a def attribute, for example. This is because you cannot say things like bone. You have to say the bone or a bone. In the plural, you can just say bones. But in the singular, English count nouns actually need some kind of definite, some kind of article, and we mark that by saying upsdef. We don't know what it's going to be, whether it's going to be plus or minus. We just need it to be there, this attribute. Okay, these are existential constraints. All of these ways of expressing constraints are useful for certain kinds of situations. You might want to experiment with these as you're developing your grammars, but I want you to know that these exist. There's different ways of constraining the information that's coming together. Okay, here again now examples for all of these. I've said it in words, now real live examples. Constraining equation, this was it. Saying in the second case when it's a passive, make sure it's a past participle. This is not saying this is a past participle, it is saying I'm constraining this disjunct can only happen if somebody tells me that this is a past participle, that the past participle in fact exists. Okay, here's an example of a negated constraint. We have a predicate, devour, and it says my subject number can be plural or it can be singular, but only if the third person is not third person. If the person is not, it does not have a value 3, okay? It could be first or second person, but not third person. That doesn't work. We can't say he devoured the bananas. That's bad English, okay? So that's a negated constraint. Here's the existential constraint I talked about. Banana says singular, and when it's singular, it needs to have some kind of definiteness marker. We don't know which, the or a or whatever, we don't know, but plus or minus, but we need to have that there. Okay, and this actually concludes lesson 3. The practical work that you should do is detailed in exercise 3. You will practice with templates, with lexical rules, with feature unification and different types of constraints, and with test suites. Very, very important to work with test suites. Okay, and then in the next lesson we will look more at PPs and adjuncts. But right now this concludes this lesson.